I want to talk a little bit about this issue of the poor, about colonialism, and about um, really about choice. So the point I made last night on the TV show was people have choices. You might be born poor, but I know significant numbers of poor people who've made the most of the opportunities they had. And I'd love them to have more opportunities. I'd like to maximize opportunities for the poor. But that involves more capitalism and more freedom, not less. But to say to people, because you're poor, because you were born poor, it's okay to be poor, is to trivialize them as individuals. It's to trivialize the choices that they have. It's to trivialize the free will that they have. People can choose to be successful. They can take the actions necessary to be successful. They can will themselves through reason to be successful. I mean, it really is insulting to poor people to say, born poor, stuck being poor, they need handouts. The only way they'll come out of poverty is if we give them stuff, if we redistribute wealth. It's unfair. It's unfair, we're told, that some people are born into wealth and some people are born into poverty. How can it be unfair? It's a metaphysical fact. It's reality. It's not anybody's choice. Fairness relates to individual choice, but nobody chooses to be born poor, chooses to be born rich. You can't apply morality to the fact that you're born. You can't apply fairness to what genes you have. You have the genes that you have. And now the question is, how do we create an environment in which you can maximize your abilities given whatever genes you have? And that is only possible through freedom, through capitalism. Capitalism is freedom. It's a system of freedom, political system of freedom. And when you say something like, well, they're born poor, what can they do? You're basically taking away agency from people who happen to be poor. You're being anti-poor by doing that. My view is the opposite. My view is to tell poor kids, yes, you were born poor. Yes, you will have fewer opportunities than my children. But you know what? You still have opportunities. And if you apply yourself, if you study hard, if you think, if you use your mind, if you apply yourself intellectually and in terms of work, you can still achieve. You can still be successful. You can still attain happiness. The goal of life ultimately is happiness. That is not blocked to you because you were born poor. Now, I get it. It's going to be harder for you than for other people. But you know what? Somebody born middle class or born rich, it's no guarantee. Because they don't apply themselves often, because they cruise off of their parents' wealth, because they're spoiled rotten, or because they just choose not to think, not to use their mind, not to apply their agency. They're not going to be happy. They're not going to be successful at life. You can be. Anybody can be. Stop using your poverty as an excuse. Stop using your circumstances as an excuse. And to the middle class, upper middle class, wealthy, intellectual snobs who present themselves as defenders of the poor by telling them that they have no chance, by telling them that without a handout, they can't succeed. Well, to hell with you. You're doing more damage than good. You're destroying the lives of young, ambitious, poor people. Indeed, the biggest victims of the mixed economy that you advocate for, the biggest victims of that mixed economy are ambitious, poor people. The answer is free will. The answer is agency. The answer is apply yourself. And at whatever level you apply yourself, you don't have to be super smart to be super happy. You have to set your goals consistent with your ability, achieve those goals, live a good life, live a life of purpose, of reason, self-esteem, and you can achieve happiness. And when you tell people you're too poor to be successful, you're too stupid to be successful, you're too incompetent to be successful, when they're kids, when they're young, when they haven't done anything yet, you're destroying lives. That is true evil. Here, take a check because we know you're too incompetent to ever succeed by yourself. But that is what people do, left and right. And then they do it on a big scale. Not just on the scale of individuals, but now on the scale of countries. That's what this woman last night was trying to say. You know, European guilt. The reason countries in Africa are poor is because of colonialism. No. The reason African countries are poor is because the African people in those countries, have chosen not to embrace Western values. They've chosen not to embrace freedom, capitalism, individual rights, property rights. And indeed, African countries that embraced even a little bit of this have done relatively well. The reason they're poor is not because of past exploitation. Granted, that exploitation did happen. The reason they're poor is because they're not willing to embrace what leads to success. At the end of the Korean War, really until the early 1960s, so well after the Korean War, South Korea was as poor as Africa was. Why is South Korea so much richer than Africa today? Because South Korea embraced better policies, better politicians, better political structure, more freedom, more political and economic freedom. South Korea was colonized for decades and decades, really since the end of the 19th century. South Korea Korea Peninsula generally had to deal with Japanese colonialism. Japanese were brutal in Korea. They were horrific. If you've seen Mr. Sunshine, probably my favorite TV show, you get a glimpse of what it was like. And yet, you get two parts of Korea choosing two different political systems. The one has thrived and the one has become maybe one of the most oppressive, maybe the most oppressive place on planet Earth. Not because of colonialism, because they made bad choices. They chose bad leaders. They did not learn from the success of the West. But some places did. South Korea did. Taiwan did. Hong Kong did. Singapore did to some extent at least. Even China did to some extent. Certainly Japan did in post-World War II. In Africa, places that are slowly learning this, like Rwanda, like Botswana, I think, a few others, that are embracing private property, that embraces institutions, that respect contracts and respect law, rule of law, are doing fine. Some of the fastest growing economies in the world today are in Africa. Others that are still mired in the victimhood associated with colonialism have brutal dictators, which they replaced with other brutal dictators, and go nowhere. That's not a legacy of colonialism. That's a legacy of tribalism. That's a legacy of the choices they are making. They could overthrow those brutal dictators. They do all the time. Just replace them with the same kind of person. And indeed, she mentioned that African countries are poor because they were exploited by colonialism. We stole all their wealth. Really? I mean, this is particularly weird and strange and mind-blowing. Was Africa really that rich when colonialism started? Was there really wealth in Africa? And we, not me, but the Brits, the French, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Germans, Belgians, did they make them poorer? No, there's no wealth. Now, there were natural resources, but natural resources are worthless unless you have an industrial society for which they're being used. It's not that we took Africa from being rich to being poor by exploiting in a zero-sum world. Now, it is true. I do not want to whitewash colonialism. Colonialism was often brutal, illegitimately, immorally so. It was often exploitative. It's still, in many of these countries, people are still being exploited. Colonialism was often nasty, mean, racist. I mean, the slave trade is a good example. But also, in particular, I remember reading about Belgian colonialism as being particularly brutal. It was harsh. Partially, it was harsh just because advanced civilization meeting a primitive civilization, as Ayn Rand makes the point, bad stuff is going to happen. But it wasn't just that. There were choices that the colonists made that they didn't have to make in terms of suppressing the freedom of the people they were colonizing in ways that were unnecessary, unnecessarily brutal, unnecessarily murderous. And that should not be whitewashed. But at the same time, colonialism also brought amazing technology, resources, wealth to these places. The railroads in India, or more importantly than the railroads in India. More important than railroads in India was the educational system in India. Educational system in India and Pakistan, unfortunately, hasn't really, it's been undercut in Pakistan by Islam, but in India, the tech schools, the fact that they all speak English, the fact that they get, at least if you're in the right caste, that you get a great education based on the British system of education, has benefited India enormously, particularly once the Indian economy was allowed freed up. So I was talking today at the event we did here in London to a man from Iraq. Now, he has an amazing story, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing the story publicly, but I will share it in a minute. He has an amazing story about discovering Ayn Rand. Maybe the best story I've ever heard about discovering Ayn Rand. Blew me away. But he has a story about Iraq being this primitive, horrible, corrupt place before the British occupied it. The British occupied it after World War I, 1917. And how the British brought Iraq schools and infrastructure, education, eradicated corruption, institutions. It changed Iraq completely. And yes, it was ultimately corrupted by Saddam Hussein and today completely corrupt. But the British were good for Iraq. And the British were good for a lot of places. Now, again, this is not to whitewash British brutality in some of their colonies. They did some horrible things in India. They did some horrible things in South Africa. They were brutal and mean and nasty and immoral. But you can't ignore the good. And what African countries didn't do post-colonization, and that India didn't do for a long time. It took India until the late 1980s, early 1990s to start benefiting. What they didn't do is embrace the better parts, the good that the colonists brought with them, the Enlightenment values, the respect for technology and learning and study and education. If they had embraced those things and freedom and the institutions of freedom, including property rights, and if they'd embraced those, is there any doubt that these countries would be richer and better? But this is the point I made at the show yesterday. Instead of telling them that, instead of educating them about the value of freedom, about the value of capitalism, about the value of political freedom, economic freedom, property rights, instead of giving them the benefit of making the choice for themselves, what do? What does the West do? It does the same thing it does to the poor. It says, your poverty is not your fault. The violence in your countries is not your fault. It's our fault. We made you into a victim. We, through colonialism, are responsible for all the death and destruction and poverty that exist in your countries. We ask for forgiveness and will send you checks, and we don't expect much from you, and we don't expect you to adopt the institutions of freedom and adopt the institutions of success. We're gonna let you, we're gonna give you a free pass because you're the victim. And it's our fault that you're poor. And what we need is more sacrifice on our part to compensate. And that's, again, treating them like children. It's treating them like they're not moral, political agents of themselves. I think it's racist to say Africans, well, what can you do? They were victimized 100 years ago. What can you do? It's degrading to the Africans that they're being told constantly by the West, it's our fault. You're poor because of us. No, they're not. They're poor because of their choices they made. We didn't help. We're still not helping. Indeed, we're hurting. This victim mentality. And it's the guilt. And as Jennifer says, it's condescending. We're superior to you. We can figure out freedom. We can handle property rights. We can handle voting and democracy and institutions. You can't. Because we did bad things to you. It's our fault. We'll take on the burden of the guilt. But don't worry, be happy. Well, don't be happy. You can't be happy because you're victims. It's sad. It's sad. What we should be doing is exporting our values. What we should be doing is exporting the ideas that we know guarantee human prosperity. We know are successful. We know are good in the context of human flourishing. We know that they lead to flourishing. Instead, we're abandoning those values ourselves. We're reverting back to a Middle Ages mentality. We're embracing Middle Ages values. We're rejecting the Enlightenment, embracing Plato, embracing mysticism, embracing the nation states, walls, socialism, control, lack of free speech. Instead of asking Africa to become like us, we're becoming like China. And China, by the way, is exporting their ideology. China is aggressively encouraging people to mimic them, is exporting their institutions, exporting their experience. You want to be rich like China? Embrace our authoritarian methodology. China is a real threat because they are willing to expand. They're willing to educate people about their ideology. They're not embarrassed. They don't feel guilty. They're not ashamed. But the West refuses to do so. The West is not just stabbing Africa in the back. It's stabbing itself in the back. So what we need is what we've always needed. Nothing new here. We need a return to the values of the Enlightenment, the true Western values, an understanding of the universal principles, that guarantee human flourishing. A respect for reason, science, the human mind, and a recognition that it's all about the individual and that the state's only role is to protect that individual. It's not to protect the culture. It's not to protect the nation, whatever the hell that is. It's to protect the rights of individuals. It's to protect your freedom. That's what was understood by Enlightenment thinkers. Now we have Ayn Rand, who provides a much more robust, grounded, philosophically integrated system to protect the values of Western civilization, the values of the Enlightenment. Ayn Rand is the culmination, in many regards, of Enlightenment thinking. She's the integrator of all the best ideas from the Enlightenment and grounds them in a proper philosophical structure. That's why you should read Ayn Rand. And that's why you should advocate for Ayn Rand. Not for this nonsense that the West is descending into, both on the left and on the right, you know. Anyway, that is my my monologue. It's all about personal responsibility, but not in a kind of conservative, superficial way. It's all about taking responsibility for your whole life, for your life, all the way down. All the way down. It's taking responsibility for your mind, taking responsibility for your soul, building, creating, making a soul. And then insisting on being free. Because freedom is the only political system appropriate for thinking, rational, responsible individuals. Individuals with self-esteem would demand freedom. And then exporting those ideas to the rest of the world because, hey, we would be much better off here if the rest of the world agreed with these ideas. It's a big fight we have in front of us. It's not going to be easy. The forces arrayed against us are significant. But hey, we got the best on our side. Truth, reality. Can't ask for more than that. Can't ask for more than that. You got to export the ideas of the Enlightenment, which will bring about capitalism like that. And we did that. We did that in Japan. We did that in South Korea. We did that in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. But we have to be convinced of the goodness of those ideas first, and we're not. The West is not being murdered. The West is not being killed. The West is not being overrun. The West is committing suicide because we're abandoning the values that made us the West.
And to begin with, I wonder if I can ask you to capsulize. I know this is difficult. Can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute. That man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it. And that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith.
On faith?
Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason, and morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
All right. All right.
Now, may I define what my morality is?
All right.
Because this is merely an introduction. My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute, by which I mean that he has to hold reason as his only guide to action, and that he must live by the independent judgment of his own mind, that his highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness, and that he must not force other people, nor accept their right to force him, that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest.
May I?
All right, before we go on, reminder, please like the show. We've got 163 live listeners right now, 30 likes. That should be at least 100. I figure at least 100 of you actually like the show. Maybe there are like 60 of the Matthews out there who hate it. But at least the people who are liking it, you know, I want to see a thumbs up. There you go. Start liking it. I want to see that go to 100. All it takes is a click of a thing, whether you're looking at this. And you know, the likes matter. It's not an issue of my ego. It's an issue of the algorithm. The more you like something, the more the algorithm likes it. So, you know, and if you don't like the show, give it a thumbs down. Let's see your actual views being reflected in the likes. But if you like it, don't just sit there. Help get the show promoted. Of course, you should also share. And you can support the show at JeronBrooksShow.com/support, or on Patreon or Subscribestar or Locals, and show your support for the work, for the value hopefully you're receiving from this. And of course, don't forget, if you're not a subscriber, even if you just come here to troll, or even if you're here like Matthew to defend Marx, then you should subscribe, because that way you'll know when to show up. You'll know what shows are on, when they're on. You'll get notified, right? So, yes, like, share, subscribe, support. Like, share, subscribe, support. There you go. Easy. Do one or all of those, please.